Good morning and welcome to day 2 of OCASI's Executive Directors Forum 2020. We know that our first day yesterday was a resounding success from all of your comments that you shared with us. Today, I want to welcome you to our opening plenary with Professor John Powell. But first, before I introduce John, I would like to send a shout out to our funders who have made this forum possible, from the federal government, Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, from the Government of Ontario, the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services, Immigration Division, and the United Way of Greater Toronto. And of course, you, the OCASI membership. It is always good for us to acknowledge the land where we are located. And so this morning, I want to acknowledge that OCASI is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Chippewa and the Wendat peoples. Toronto is now home to many diverse peoples, the Inuit and the Métis, and is under the stewardship, most recently, of the Mississaugas of the Credit. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. I also want to acknowledge my African ancestors, brought here as an enslaved people against their will over 400 years ago. I acknowledge and pay homage to the legacy of resistance they've bequeathed me and commit to continuing their solidarity with Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas. Now it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our man of the hour, Professor John A. Powell. Professor Powell, it is such a thrill for us to have you here with us in Canada.
Debbie, it's very nice to be here.
John A. Powell is Director of the Othering and Belonging Institute and Professor of Law, African American and Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. He was previously the Executive Director at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University, and prior to that, the founder and director of the Institute for Race and Poverty at the University of Minnesota. John formerly served as the National Legal Director of the American Civil Liberties Union, better known as ACLU. He is a co-founder of the Poverty and Race Research Action Council and serves on the boards of several national and international organizations. Professor Powell led the development of an opportunity-based model that connects affordable housing to education, health, healthcare, and employment, and is well known for his work developing the frameworks of targeted universalism and othering and belonging to effect equity-based interventions. John has taught at numerous law schools, including Harvard and Columbia University. His latest book is Racing to Justice, Transforming Our Concepts of Self and Other to Build an Inclusive Society. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor John Powell. John, we look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Debbie. It's very nice to be here with you virtually. I wish I could be there with you in person. And I feel like Canada and many of the people there and the work you're doing are close friends. So I'm going to be talking to you today about othering and belonging and how that fits into equity and the larger work that you're doing. And then after the talk, I think Avvy and I will have a conversation to go deeper. So again, I appreciate the work you're doing, and I hope you find the presentation useful. So I'm trying to advance the slides, and they're not moving just yet. Oh, there you go. So the problem of othering in many ways, and this is actually, you'll recognize it, a play on W.B. Du Bois. When he said race was the problem of the 20th century, I'm suggesting othering is the problem of the 21st century. And it could be the demise of the nation state. It's something that's happening in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, in Africa. It's virtually a global problem. Having a little trouble with my slides, but of all the forces shaping politics and power around the world, perhaps none are more important than our sense of who we are and who we are becoming. We are in a period of accelerated change in at least 4 areas: globalization, technology, the environment, and demographic change. We can only process so much change in a short period of time without experiencing anxiety, which is a normal biological reaction. But how we respond to this anxiety is social. Our response is greatly shaped by the stories presented by leadership and through culture. These stories speak to our deepest values and our core beliefs about who we are, many of which operate at the subconscious level. We can respond to these changes either as a threat or as an opportunity. The first response is breaking. The second is bridging. Breaking can create a deep fear of other groups, making it easier to accept false stories of us versus them. Breaking perpetuates isolation, hardens racism, and builds oppressive systems, while driving our politics and institutions toward anti-democratic and inhumane practices. The other response is bridging, which calls on us to imagine a larger, more inclusive we. When we bridge, we see demographic change and our diverse identities as positive and enhancing who we are. Bridging calls on us to engage in healthy dialogue and requires us to listen deeply. Bridging does not mean abandoning your identity. Bridging means acknowledging our shared humanity, rejecting that there is a them, and moving toward a future where there is instead a new us. For when we bridge, we not only open up to others, we also open up to changes within ourselves, where we can participate in creating a society built on belonging. So, in many ways, this little video captures a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today. And this is a graph just to highlight it. One sort of footnote, we changed our name since we've done the video. So we're no longer the Haas Institute, we're the Othering and Belonging Institute. Also, you might notice that when we talk about all the things that we're being exposed to for change, we didn't mention the pandemic. Again, that happened after the video, but I think the larger point that the world is changing very fast and that change produces anxiety is even more true. And how we deal with that anxiety depends on leadership, on narrative, on structures, on organizing. And the 2 major ways is to actually address that change and meet that change as a source of a threat and fear, and blame it on some group. And who gets blamed on varies as we move around the world. So it could be immigrants, it could be indigenous people, it could be Black people, it could be Muslims, or in a sense, the source of the other is empty. That's filled in part because it's not real, but it feels real once it's filled in. And once we other people, bad things tend to happen to those people and to our entire society. The other major response is bridging. Bridging is based on the notion that we're expanding who we are. We're not static. And we come together and listen to each other deeply, empathetically. And that's caught in a situation that creates a sense of belonging and inclusion. So when you're other, these are some of the indices that you can see that's happening to a population. A population that's other doesn't have an effective voice. It lacks sufficient representation. lacks recognition. Thinking of Charles Teller's work around the politics of recognition, and lacks power. So these are some of the things that happens to a group once it's othered. And again, the way we other people, these are some of the ways in which we do it, but it's a general process, and so it could be anything. And each society has its own primary way of othering, and they use that to figure out how to other new people. So othering and belonging. I know there are funny names, funny concepts, a little wonky. I want to actually just drill down a little bit and move you a little bit beyond diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is the predominant way that groups actually approach these issues. And that's been an important step that's been going on since the 90s, but it's limited. And I think othering and belonging helps us go to another level. So inclusion, what's wrong with inclusion? Well, I think you do a fairly good job, at least from what we can see down here in the United States and Canada. So the way most people practice inclusion is to insist that if you're going to join something, you have to actually make all the adjustments. You're joining something that's already there. You're joining as a guest. The example I oftentimes use is if I'm giving a party, I would love for all of you to come when COVID is over, but it's my party, my music, my friends, and my food. And all those things might be fine, but it's my party, you're a guest. That's inclusion, the way it's practiced in most situations. Belonging says that, no, it's not my party, it's our party. So it's our food, our friends, our music. It's our party. And so in belonging, you actually co-create the thing you belong to. It's not just there. You're not just joining something as a guest. You're contributing to its very structure and existence. So that's the difference between belonging and inclusion. Well, what about equity? Well, the way most groups practice equity is to focus almost entirely on disparities. Now, disparities can be a problem, and so it's an appropriate focus, but it's too limited. To give you a concrete example, I'm involved in a situation in Detroit, dealing with students in schools, and Black children are graduating with only 20% of them being able to read at grade level. 20%. White students, there are not many white students in Detroit school system, but there's some, they're graduating at 50% able to read at grade level. If you just focus on disparities, then you try to actually either meet somewhere in the middle or even get Black students to that 50% level. But 50% is too low. And so it normalizes, when we focus on disparities alone, it normalizes the favorite group, in this case, whites. And it ignores that what we really want is for all the students to graduate with reading proficiency. Now that does a couple of things. It actually moves the bar for white and Black students. It actually lessens competition between the students. And it creates a narrative where we all belong instead of we are fighting each other. So the opposite of othering is not saming, but belonging. Again, sometimes when liberals think of the other and the way of intervening with the other is to say, well, we're all the same. And then some deep fundamental level that may be true, but in practice, we're not all the same. And so it's not enough to just say we're all the same, but acknowledge our differences and say to people that you bring your full humanity to the table. Oftentimes, give the example of James Baldwin. When Baldwin was at the height of his literary career, he was invited to join this very prestigious literary club. And he was the first Black person to join this club. And they said to him, Mr. Baldwin, we recognize you're a wonderful writer, and we'd be delighted to have you, but please don't show up with riffraff, which meant black, code for black. And it says, also, we know you're gay. Could you not remind us of that? It's an early version of don't ask, don't tell. James Baldwin did not join. He went to Europe instead, went to Paris, and he was brokenhearted because he wanted to join. And he wrote a book called The Price of the Ticket. And he talked about the price of belonging, the price of being included was too high. It required that I leave essential parts of myself at the door. And so that's not belonging. And again, too often, that's how we practice inclusion. Belonging is you bring every aspect of yourself to the table. So belonging is also having access to things in society. But it's more than just access, it's also the right to co-create. And so it takes us beyond inclusion. In some ways, the heart of belonging is co-creating and being seen. We all need to be recognized. We all need to have a voice, and that's what belonging is about. And this is some data on Canada. You know, this is shaky ground because you probably know this data much better than I do. But it basically, look at your population. 22% of Canada are made up of visible minorities. Of that, the primary groups are South Asian, Chinese, and Black. And 21% of Canadians are immigrants. And 6.2% of Canadians are Indigenous. Like the rest of the world, Canada's been grappling with COVID, and you've had emergency response for 4 months. And then you've also had special funding projects for Indigenous communities, and the government has acknowledged the general impact of social distancing, recognizing that it doesn't affect all people the same, including special aid for people without homes. I'll come back to that. This is very consistent with what we talk about in terms of targeted universalism and belonging. Part of it is recognizing that we're situated differently, so we can't have a response that's the same for everyone. We haven't learned that lesson here in the United States. And so talking about targeted universalism and belonging is a way of actually acknowledging that people are situated differently and therefore need different pathways to fully belong and be healthy. And I know sometimes probably close up it doesn't feel this way, but from a distance it looks like your government is doing much better than ours. For example, you recognize the racialized impact of COVID. In the United States, we've had a hard time recognizing that, and when we do recognize it, we blame it on the marginalized groups themselves. So in Canada, as in much of the country, the virus rates are disproportionately higher in the Black community, the low-income community, and among essential workers. And this data should be used to actually affect the distribution of resources and benefits. I should say the collection of data is extremely important, disaggregated data, but so is the story that we tell around this data. So it's not enough to collect the data. It's important to have a story or a narrative as to help people to understand what it actually means. This is a way of demonstrating the impact of the data of the COVID on different populations. The green represent the share of population in Toronto. The darker shade represent the share of COVID cases. And you can see if it was perfect, green perfectly distributed, I should say, the green and the dark color would be at the same height. But instead we see that the dark color is higher for marginalized or visibly minority and lower for whites. This is a similar graph, but it does by income. And we see a similar thing, that the lower your income, the higher proportion of your community is affected by COVID. The higher your income, the lower your population percentage is affected by COVID. This map that I'll make these PowerPoints available. This map actually just is a visual representation of how COVID affects populations and where they are. And this is just a similar expression, but it's expressed in graphic terms or in number terms. So what we know is that we live in structures, and when something happened, those structures have an impact in terms of how whatever is happening is amplified or experienced. So prior to COVID, most visible minorities were already likely to live in poverty than whites. And so when the pandemic hit, unemployment, impact, again, disproportionately affected those same communities. So one of the things that structures do is amplify what's any new precarious situation, which means the government and all of us have to be attentive to that if we are going to move toward equity and belonging. Instead, what happens oftentimes is the opposite. That instead of having a program that reaches out and helps ethnic minorities or more vulnerable people, we actually punish those people. And so this is a reported experience of discrimination during the pandemic. And we see that discrimination has risen for a number of groups. So there's been a proliferation of anti-Asian hate speech and the rise of right-wing extremists. And the government respond to this misinformation is generally to be silenced instead of taking concrete steps. This takes us back to the video you just watched. And so what is the story that we tell? And one story in dealing with this larger anxiety is that it's the other's fault. It's some group that is to be blamed for the ills of your society. And again, that's breaking. And while it's happening in Canada and the United States, it's also happening all around the world. One other thing, it's important to note that who the other is considered to be changes as we move from society to society. But there's almost always a racialized and sometimes religious other. In the United States, we're delighted, for example, that your Prime Minister speaks of anti-Black racism. We can't imagine the leaders in the United States in most instances acknowledging racism, especially anti-Black racism. The literature suggests, though, that maybe not go far enough. It's too often it's just seen as an American phenomenon, and unfortunately, that's not true. It's also it's important to have a transnational movement. These problems actually don't stop at the border, although in fact they actually don't replicate themselves exactly the same. So how does Canadian people deal with anti-Black racism today? And what's an effective way to address that? And is it a safe haven for the United States? I can tell you that, and this is no exaggeration, the interest in Americans in Canada, possibly moving to Canada, is very closely tied to what's happening in this election. From my perspective, if this election goes in the wrong way, you get this flood of interest of people trying to get to Canada or someplace outside the United States, even though it may only be marginally better. So one of the things that's important is telling stories. And when you tell stories or construct a story, think about who's in the story, who's represented, who's left out, what's their role. And so again, oftentimes visible minorities become invisible. They're not in stories at all. Or if they are in stories, they're not in stories in a complementary or useful way. One way you deal with that is to make sure that people participate in telling their own story. That we're not just telling stories about people, but they participate. Again, they get to co-create. Similarly, what's the story of Canada? What's the story of the whole country? And who tells those stories? Yesterday, I was in the car and I was listening to NPR News, National Public Radio in the United States, and they were talking about voting and the election. And there was a special that went on for at least 20 minutes. And they talked about, appropriately, white voters and Trump voters. There was no mention of Latinos. There's no mention of Asians. There's no mention of blacks. There's no mention of indigenous people. Listen to that report, and this is a liberal radio station. You either thought America was an entirely white country. So belonging. Belonging requires a number of things. As I suggested, the heart of it is co-creating. In order to do that, you need a number of things. You need agency, a sense of who you are. You need power, the ability to affect things, the ability to speak, the ability to actually change things. You need care or love. You have to care not just about yourself, but also about the larger group that you're engaging with, the larger container you're engaging with. And you need responsibility. This is an interesting concept. When we look at what's going on with marginalized populations, there's oftentimes a sense of who's at fault, who is responsible for these structures that depress the life outcomes of various populations. And this model basically says we're all responsible. And that part of belonging requires that we recognize we're responsible, not just for ourselves, but for everyone and for the container itself. I should say that we also recognize that groups are not similarly situated. So a group with more power has more responsibility, not necessarily because they have more guilt. Having more power means that we need more responsibility. This is not just at the government level, it's in private sector, it's in a nonprofit. So the leader of a nonprofit or the leader of a company has more power and therefore more responsibility than someone who's just starting out or someone who's at a different level. But everyone has power, but it's just not evenly distributed. In order to sort of build belonging, we also have to build trust. Sometimes we say down in here in the United States that change happens at the speed of trust. We actually need to create ways in which we can begin to trust each other and work together. A lot of it's relational. Here in the United States, we're engaged in something called deep canvassing, which is interesting, and our group had a hand in developing this. Deep canvassing is where you really listen to people, where you establish a relationship with people. It takes much more time. It's not just a script. Instead of 3 or 4 minutes, as in traditional canvassing, it could take a half an hour. But a recent survey has shown that deep canvassing is about 100 times more effective than traditional canvassing. And part of it is because it establishes that human connection. So again, we talked about breaking. It's when groups turn inward and they turn on other groups. Bonding is when you care about a group, but it's not denigrating other groups. So I bond with my family, but I'm not putting down your family, but I have a really cool family. Bridging is where we connect with people who are apparently different than us. And we connect through stories, through structures, through contact. And we have to learn to build bridges at different levels, not just interpersonal level, but also the structural level, institutional level, the cultural level. and learn to bridge with those that we think of as different than us. When I shared this information with a friend of mine who's very active here in the United States, named Pastor Mike McBride, he said, "So John, are you saying I have to bridge with the devil?" And my response was, don't start there. Start with shorter bridges. There are long bridges and short bridges. So start with the shorter bridges until you get that muscle working, and then you can build longer bridges. But I said, also be careful who you call the devil. So bridging is hard, and oftentimes remind people that you may be attacked by your group or by other groups when you try to bridge. Bell Hooks oftentimes says that, that bridges are made to walk on. So it's an important practice, but it's not something that happens without some challenge. So again, belonging requires not just that we see each other, that we recognize each other. It also requires that our structures are organized in such a way to say that we belong, that the culture says that we belong. So how do we build communities of power between different minority groups in Canada? And I would actually expand this question, because ultimately you have to build power and bridges between all groups, minority and non-minority. So part of it is understanding both the impediments and opportunity, find and confront discrimination, create affirmative goals, not just closing disparities. What's the goal you're trying to create for everyone? And to be critical and skeptical maybe, but not cynical. This is back to the notion that there are short bridges and there are long bridges. So start with the short bridges. Start what's doable, and you'll get better at it. And then as you get better at it, you can actually move further. We actually don't know how far we can bridge. And I should say bridging, which requires empathetic practice, so compassionate listening and compassionate practices. Bridging doesn't mean agreeing with someone. It doesn't mean you're taking their position. What it does mean is that you're willing to actually see them as a human being, and compassion to suffer with. You're willing to listen to them in a non-judgmental way. So targeted universalism helps us with this, because it basically says we all want to get to this universal, and that the structure is designed so that we don't. How do we actually develop this? So you have to have a universal goal. We're all trying to get to 100% reading proficiency. But because we're situated differently, the strategy for getting there will be targeted based on how we're situated. That's how we get to targeted universalism. Universal goal, targeted strategies. And it's for everyone. So here are just some examples. Trying to get everyone to the third floor. You have an escalator. An escalator doesn't work for someone in a wheelchair. Now, a couple of things. Structures are never neutral. Structures are normalized, also oftentimes unconsciously, in favor of one group and as opposed to another group. And it doesn't necessarily mean that someone's carrying conscious animus at all. But we have to look at the way what structures are doing. And so the goal is not to remove structural discrimination, that is a goal, but to organize structures, to co-create structures, to actually create belonging for everyone. So to affirmatively use structures to produce the outcomes we want. So sometimes we say, let's stop discriminating, but the structures do more than just discriminate or not discriminate. They do work. They actually advance certain outcomes and retard other outcomes. If you have children, you would not be satisfied if your child said, I went to school this year and it was great, I wasn't discriminated against. That's great, but what did you learn? How did it advance you as a human being, as getting to know yourself? So make structures work for us. And, you know, in the United States, we have accommodation for people with disability. But if you built a structure appropriately with co-creating, you wouldn't just accommodate. You would actually design it to actually do what you want it to do. You know, we were talking in the 90s, people talked about toleration. We don't talk about that more. We've moved beyond that. So again, starting with the universal, data helps in terms of target universalism, so you can see how groups are situated. Target universalism is outcome-oriented, not process-oriented. So what's the outcome you want? State it. What's the universal that you want? And what's in the way? And what can we do affirmatively to move toward that universal? And one of the things we recommend is that you engage in something called opportunity mapping. We've done that now for a number of years in the United States. It's quite powerful. We're doing it for the whole state of California, where you can visibly map the distribution of opportunity and then overlay that with different populations. And that gives you a sense of how people are situated with structures and possible pathways to moving forward. And some of that is happening in COVID. At the beginning of the presentation, when we talked about some of the stuff that Canada is doing in terms of recognizing that different people need different things. And there's also some of that done in the United States, at least in California, where the government actually disaggregates data, and then it looks at vulnerable population and use that in terms of making decisions around COVID. This is a map, opportunity map. It's looking at several different indicators, and we do this all over the country, and using anywhere from 14 to 100 different indicators to map out the distribution of opportunity physically, and then overlay it with populations. And in this map, the lighter the area, the higher opportunity it is. The darker the area, the lower opportunity. Excuse me, I got to reverse. The lighter the area, the lower the opportunity, the darker the area, the higher the opportunity. And you can imagine, it's understandable that people with a lot of resources tend to live in high opportunity areas. What does that mean? Again, you can fill in the details, but it's also better schools, stores, parks, cleaner air. I'm sure you've seen the data that says you can, how long someone lives depends largely on their zip code beyond the individual behavior. So the physical space is doing some work. How do you actually make sure that every group has access to opportunity? So how do you operationalize target universalism to promote belonging? You have to take into account the group's difference. You have to be aware of their situatedness. The goal is to include everyone. It's both a communication strategy and a programmatic strategy. Avoid breaking. And sometimes in equity, we focus on what we perceive as a scarce resource, and then we have groups fight over it. And so when you approach equity that way, you're actually creating breaking, and breaking actually retards the opportunity for certainly the designated group, but for all groups. So this is from you, the opportunity for increased belonging and structural transformation. Envision a future of egalitarian Canada where the rights of all people are respected and Indigenous people demand for justice, sovereignty, and full nation-to-nation relationship with Canada is supported. color of change, color of poverty, color of change. So that ends my formal presentation, and I look forward to having a conversation with Avvy and all of you.
Thank you, John, for this wonderful learnings. I'm sure that our audience gained as much as I did from listening to you. But we're not done yet. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce our moderator for this morning, who will be in conversation with Professor Powell, Avvy Go. Avvy is the clinic director of the Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic. Avvy received her Bachelor of Arts degree in Economics and Management Studies from the University of Waterloo and her law degrees from the University of Toronto and Osgoode Hall Law School. Since her call to the bar in 1991, she has worked exclusively in the legal clinic system, serving the legal needs of low-income individuals and families, the majority of whom are non-English speaking immigrants and refugees. Immigration, human rights, and employment law are some of the main areas of her practice. In 2007, Avvy co-founded the Color of Poverty, Color of Change campaign, a campaign to address the increasing racialization of poverty in Ontario and across Canada. Welcome, Avvy Go.
Thank you, Debbie, for the introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me to help moderate this important conversation with John today. John, it's such a great honor to have you joining us today from Berkeley this morning. I know you're several hours ahead of us, so I'm sort of particularly appreciative of your time in joining us today. And it's really a privilege for me to share this same virtual stage with you. I have been a fan of yours for many years, and I'm very excited that I get to ask you a bunch of questions that I've always wanted to ask. Many of you the audience may not know that John has been a friend with Color Poverty, Color of Change for many years. In fact, when we had our first provincial forum back in 2008, John came to that forum and had joined with us on some of the conversations about these issues, these very important issues. So it's really great to have you back here with us. As I'm the moderator, I get to ask my first question myself, although I must say that this question actually, I think, fit well with some of the questions that are already starting to come in through the live chat. So my first question has to do with the Othering and Belonging Institute and applying it to a Canadian context. And I think that certainly I agree with you that there are some differences between Canada and the US in the sense that, we don't have a leader of our country who openly courts the white supremacists by telling them to stand back and stand down just in case, they are needed. Nor do we have a voting system that is designed deliberately to suppress votes by racialized groups, although there are a lot of barriers in accessing to voting as well. But and until very recently, the Canadian government actually doesn't really acknowledge the existence of racism. We, for many years, have used the multiculturalism kind of framework when we talk about race. And oftentimes the general, society, Canadians, we just kind of congratulate ourselves on simply not being Americans. And so a lot of times, it's very hard to have a conversation about race because while I think we're moving towards a more open dialogue, there's a lot of gaps in that conversation. So for instance, like in some of the recent, cases we've seen, the RCMP, that's our National Police Service, basically they just stand on the sideline when white commercial fishermen attack and burn down lobster pounds belonging to Mi'kmaq fishermen in Nova Scotia who are merely trying to exercise their treaty rights to fish. We still have some provincial premiers who refuse to acknowledge the existence of systemic racism, even after a case of indigenous woman who died in a public hospital after being denied care and after being berated with racist insults by healthcare workers. The premier of Quebec still say there is no systemic racism in Quebec. And so, and we also know, as you noted, there's been a rise of anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, sort of, and all the pre-existing racial inequalities have been exacerbated by COVID-19. Not to mention a lot of challenges faced by migrant workers, people with precarious status. So a lot of us basically ask this kind of questions, right? How do you engage in, discussion about belonging or discussion about anti-Black racism without acknowledging colonialism, without when we deny the existence of racism? And how do you have that conversation with the person on the other end who may in some cases deny your very right to exist?
So that's a very important question, and it's a hard question, but I'll say a couple of things. I won't purport to answer it, but I'll say something. Well, first of all, I think it's certainly in the U.S., but also we do work in Europe and Latin America and Africa, and the issue of othering is actually present in all those places. It's actually, as I said, a global phenomenon, and sometimes it's around race. As you know, in India, it's around religion. Oftentimes it's around sexual orientation. In Africa, oftentimes it's around immigration status. So I think you have to work at multiple levels, and I think leadership and stories matter. And I think there are people who influence other people. So for example, in the United States, wearing a mask was not an issue until Trump said it was an issue. And then all of a sudden people felt like, some of his supporters, like, I'll die rather than wear a mask. Well, you will die if you don't wear a mask, but go ahead. My point is that they didn't come to that position by themselves. They had help. And so part of it is, what are the stories that are populating Canada? How do people show up? And if you don't have those larger containers, it's hard for just on an individual basis, whether it's the police or whether it's someone in the street, to hear, right? They're not necessarily getting their sense of the country or the sense of history from me or from you. They're getting it from other places. So can you actually influence those other places? Also, structures matter. How do you distribute money? How do you distribute power? And then this is what I was in some ways implying it when I talked about equity. In the United States, we don't do a very good job of talking about race. We talk about it a lot, but it's almost always zero sum. It's almost always framed in terms of breaking. And it's not just breaking between whites and blacks. It's sometimes breaking between blacks and Latinos, or between radical blacks and conservative blacks. There's so much pain, there's so much trauma, that when someone finally gets the mic to talk about it, in talking about the trauma, sometimes they actually break or even dehumanize other people. And so I think and when you do that, it's hard. And I'll give you a concrete example. When we talk about, in the narrow sense, and it's not, I always say an analysis is not the same as communication strategy. Can we listen to someone else's pain? And in the United States, sometimes we say there's a sort of a oppressive Olympic. So we say, the worst thing that ever happened to a people is slavery. And then she would say, well, no, what about Native Americans, the genocide? I said, well, no, what about Mexicans when they went to sleep in Canada and woke up in the United States because they had moved the border? And then said, no, what about, and literally I've been in meetings where people are at each other's throat, people of color, fighting about whose situation is the worst. And part of it is they assume that that's how you get attention. And it's also really felt, but it doesn't make space for other people's concerns. And so bridging actually invites us. It says to us, yes, can we listen to other people's concerns and find a voice and a space to actually talk about our concerns as well. And as I talked about in terms of deep canvassing, the impact of that, and that's not just the purpose of it, but the impact of it is phenomenal. I mean, 100% more effective. And part of it is, you start off by, it's like, how are you, Avvy? How are you doing? What's concerning to you? What are you worried about? And then once you're drawn into the conversation, then I can tell you what I'm worried about as well. But if I come at you, it's like, you are bad, and I'm not interested in your pain. I'm only interested in my own. It creates breaking. It creates more polarization. So there are actually very clear ways of moving. I'm not saying it's the solution, but moving it forward. And belonging, in that sense, is about all of us. How do we actually create a belonging where we all belong? And recognizing, again, with targeted universalism, is not saying we're all situated the same. So we will need different things. But we are concerned about all of us. We're not saying if Latinos win, blacks lose, or even if black and Latinos win, whites lose. In the context of that, I think we have to understand both our situation, how we're situated, which also means understanding our history. How do we get there? And also understanding our story. And maybe even equally important, how do we understand our future? When we argue about our past, we're really arguing about our future. And can we imagine a future, as you asked, Avvy, can we imagine a future where we all belong? Not some of us, but all of us. And then what would that future look like? And I think what happens oftentimes, again, in the United States, when we talk about race, there's this fear. And we actually sometimes invert it. It's like, well, whites were dominant. Now it's our turn to be dominant. And I'm saying, no, we're not interested in dominating. We're not interested in shifting who gets to dominate. We're trying to get rid of domination. But even we, meaning those in the social justice and racial justice movement, sometimes fall prey to that same language where we just invert who's on top.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And I guess that kind of ties to one of the questions that I see from the audience. And I think that, many of us will then try to start practicing this, let's say within our own clinic system, within the workplace. And the question becomes like, how can we as an institution make space for this kind of sharing of stories, this deep canvassing with proper support, and without ending up appropriating any of these stories?
Well, a few things. I mean, we work with groups all across the country and all across the world, and it's like anything else, right? I mean, it's like if someone says, if you were to tell me how to do the butterfly, it's like, okay, you wiggle your arms like this, and you make your body go up and down. But if I get in the water, I'm not doing the butterfly. I'm doing something else, right? I mean, so to state some of this stuff is pretty straightforward. To do it actually takes a lot of work, and we'll make some mistakes. And that's why when I talk about bridging, I say, let's start with short bridges. Let's not, people say, how do I say to a Trump supporter? Okay, let's not start there. Maybe let's start between blacks and Latinos. Let's start between conservative or moderate and progressive blacks. Let's start where the gulf is not so big, but there's still a gulf. With the deep canvassing, because we're in the middle of election, we're training people an hour. They don't become experts, but they learn how to listen. And I worry a little bit, to be honest, that it becomes just a technique, like checking the box, because it really is a profoundly shift in terms of how we show up with people. It's actually in some ways deeply spiritual. And how do we really, the South African word, sabawanu, I see you, I see you. We really need to be seen. There's all kind of research showing that when people are seen, they are much better, they begin to thrive. But again, I worry that in the United States, at least, where we're this sort of rapid culture, it's like, okay, I read that, now I'm gonna go practice it, right? And so we do need to practice. We need to, but we also need to embody it so that it's real. I'll give you just a quick example. At the head of Snapchat and Pinterest, which is two data platforms, and I'm not a data person, but anyway, they reached out to me on some of this work, and they're very interested in creating belonging cultures in their organization. And the person at Pinterest, I don't think you'd mind me sharing this. He said, this is great for work, but I feel this. I'm serious about this. I want this in my personal life. Would you be willing to occasionally have lunch or dinner and just talk about some of this stuff? And I said, sure. So he sent me an email, and my assistant, because I'm so busy, she emailed him back. She said, John's busy, but the chief of staff will actually be in touch. And I saw it, and I said, that's not appropriate. He wants a personal relationship with me. And then my chief of staff, she said, okay, that makes a lot of sense, because if he's feeling more comfortable about you, he'll give us more money. And they've given us money. And I said, and I have a lovely chief of staff and a lovely assistant. And I said, no, this is not instrumental. This is not to get him to do something. This is really to connect one human being to another. And I said, for me, this is not just technique. This is real. This is who I am. This is how I show up in the world. But like in Deep Canvas, I know it's more likely to generate more money, but that can't be the primary goal. It can't be, I'm talking to you so I can change you. It's like, when I'm really seeing you, I'm seeing you as you are. And can I empathize with that? Again, that's hard to do, but when it's done, it's really, really powerful. And there's examples of Nelson Mandela doing that in South Africa, and really ending the war in South Africa, because he had and I won't go through all the details, but he built offered a bridge to the general of the South African Army. They met in Nelson Mandela's house. Nelson Mandela served the general tea. Nelson Mandela had servants, but he served him tea. And when they negotiated, the entire negotiation took place in Afrikaner, which was the general's language. Robert Sapolsky talks about he was recognizing the general's sacred symbols. The general was an expressed racist. He had killed thousands of people. But by Nelson Mandela seeing his humanity and offering him a bridge, he touched the general in a way that was unexpected. And people were shocked that the general agreed to a treaty, a ceasefire. And then later, when Nelson Mandela stepped down from politics, the general asked if he could speak. Again, people were shocked, because this guy was not a nice guy. And he gave this speech about Nelson Mandela in Xhosa, which is Nelson Mandela's native language. So this is real stuff. But it's hard. I don't know if I could have done what Nelson Mandela did. I have someone in my house who's literally trying to kill me. And so I think you can do it. I think it takes more, obviously, than the time we have together. We have some little, educational training stuff. I always worry a little bit, like I said, that it'll be just check the box, and it's deeper than that.
Thank you. And I want to move. I know that there are a number of questions from the audience, but I do want to move to another area of the work that you do, because I think that that will help us answer some of the questions as well. Because although we don't have sort of like the kind of apartheid in South Africa and Canada, there is a different form of apartheid, and there is systemic racism. And I know that through your work with GARE, the Government Alliance on Race and Equity in the U.S., you have worked with many local and regional governments to advance racial equity. And actually, at one point, the Ontario Anti-Racism Directorate was a member of GARE. That was when we had a different government in Ontario. And I've attended some of the GARE gatherings. I know that you worked with some of the municipalities on police reform, education, housing kind of issues. And I remember hearing the mayor of Minneapolis, St. Paul, like a white dude talking about how he wanted to reform systemic racism within the police services in his city. And then at that time, our mayor in Toronto has just passed away. His name was Prof. And certainly he was not a guy who would be working on systemic racism. So, but I know that you have, worked with so many different governments. And I guess what is your secret? And, there's no way you can build that, or maybe you do build that relationship one-on-one with the over 200, governments that you work with, or is it something else that you do there that we can kind of copy here in Canada?
So I think you're doing some of it already. So I have you're right. So my worry, is that the work around belonging is like exploding in a positive way. The EU is like all over wanting to do. I'm doing work with Google, done work with Facebook. But like a lot of things, it's like I worry that people will come and take a little piece of what I'm saying. They'll take the words and they won't engage the practice. They'll just, it's like old wine in new bottles. And you have to look at it. So for example, co-creating, what does that mean in the corporate context? To me, it means power sharing. And so I'm saying, let's look at your board. Let's look at who your stakeholders, shareholders are. Have the community participate, and have them participate where they get paid. Have them participate where they have resources. What are the conditions to belong? It's not just an idea. It actually requires some stuff. And some have said, I'm willing to actually explore this with you. Others have said, interesting. Very few have said no. But one of the things, especially since George Floyd down here in the United States, I think basically two things. I say I call people in rather than calling them out. And so join us. This is different people and different movements need to have be the face of it, need to actually be in front of it. But it should be beyond just those people. And so join us. I also have this thing of saying, be hard on structures and soft on people. Oftentimes we reverse that. We're hard on people and soft on structures. And so we're very good at saying there's something wrong with you. But then it's like, well, so what's the structure? Now think about George Floyd just for a second. The fact that the 4 policemen who were present, one of them was an African-American who had joined the police force to address the issues of police brutality against the Black community. How did that happen? My sense is it's not just people, or it's not just a bad apple, it's bad soil. So in some sense, it's not letting people off the hook, but saying, what are the structures, the incentives, the narratives, the stories that people are living in that's pushing people, even Black people, into a place of anti-Black racism? And in some ways that's much harder, but in some ways it's also easier. And from my perspective, I'm not terribly interested in absolution for white guilt. I mean, that's great for somebody, maybe a church. I'm interested in change and partners in it, and a person. And when people, so now we're being invited to, you're right. So we have governments all over the country. I think it's getting close to 300 now. So when we came up with sanctuary cities, that was our work. But we did it in a way, and as you said, Avvy, it looked at our history, looked at what that meant and why we were, and we got virtually every major city in the United States involved. We had legal teams helping them sort of, because we knew the Trump administration was going to come after them. So we actually made it so that it was possible. And because we had so many cities involved, they're also protected. If you have just one city, they're more vulnerable. So we weren't asking them to fall on the sword, on the Roman concept. We're saying this is the right thing to do. We're going to help you do it, and going to move this forward. And it's interesting now, a number of those cities are coming back saying, this has been great. We actually don't want to just be an equity city. We want to be a belonging city. Help us do that. And so we're now working with some cities to sort of help them actually figure out in real terms how to operationalize the concept of belonging, because it's like equity, except it's deeper.
So a couple of the other questions from the live chat. One of them is someone is asking you to give a specific example of the difference between equity versus targeted universality, sort of in practice. So I know you used the example of the literacy
Right.
in Detroit. Is there another example that you may want to share with us? I use the term targeted universality as well when I talk to the government here, but I have to say it sounds good, but what exactly does that mean, right?
Great question. So we have a booklet on this. I'll send it to you, Avvy, so you can share it with folks. It spells out in pretty extensive details with a number of examples. Let me just give you one. So we're working with some folks up in Sacramento, which is just north of San Francisco, and these were foundations and others, and what they found is that in terms of early childhood death, babies dying, it was like 5 times higher for Black kids than for white kids, and 3 times higher if you were Latino. And they were developing this campaign to do something around it. And they, as a foundation, the Sacramento Foundation, they didn't have all that much money. And so there was a debate on staff as do we just focus on the Black kids because we don't have enough to go around, or do we in some way spread it around? And they actually called me in. They were using some of my work, our work, and so it's like, do we strategically just give all the money to the Black community, or do we spread it around and there's not enough for anybody? And I suggested they do some version of the latter. I suggested that, so again, equity was saying, let's give all the money, or they're using equity, let's give all the money to the Black parents, and because they need it the most. Again, it was closing disparities and based on scarcity. And if they had done that, they didn't do that. If they had done that, the other communities, the Latino community and white community, would feel like they're being ignored. And there'd be some political fights around why you focus on Black people. And so instead what they did is that they gave money to all groups in different proportions, and they had different programs, and they have different ways of talking about it. And this is a happy ending story. Once they did that, money poured in because everybody saw that their group was involved in this. So they ended up having enough money to do it for everybody, 100%. But by not pitting groups against each other, and it would have been easy to do. And again, there's always a story. So one story is that Blacks were doing much worse, and there are always competing narratives. So one narrative is that, well, these were mainly, what would happen is parents, and usually the mother, would sleep with their child and roll over in the night and suffocate them. That was how most of the deaths happened. But it was also happened in the Latino community and the white community, just to a different degree. And so the story was Black women were careless, neglectful. It was about Black women. Another story was the lack of cribs. So one of them is focusing on people. There's something wrong with those people, right? Another one is like focusing on structure. They don't have the resources to actually have people have the babies sleep in a crib. And it's always more complicated, but who controls that narrative matters, because it's at the end of the day, they have a program now where every low-income mother going to the hospital in Sacramento gets a crib. And, and the crib death and the deaths have come down tremendously. So that was the difference between equity, which just focus on one group, and have the sort of fight over scarce resources and who's more deserving, or focus on all the groups, but recognizing groups are not similarly situated. So equity, with the way people practice it, is to do that first example. Targeted universalism is the second. One of the things, what's the universal? Not what white people have, but not what the favorite group has. What is something we all want? And when you say that, you oftentimes find that many whites, and certainly don't have it either. They may be closer to that goal, but they don't have it. And then oftentimes blacks are further away, indigenous people are further away still. And then how you actually try to get people to that universal is going to be different based on culture, based on how people are situated, engaging people, and leaning into belonging. People have to participate themselves in co-creating this thing.
Thank you. I'm going to move to another area, which is around sort of immigrant and refugee issue, because many of the audience today come from OCASI membership. So OCASI is a network of community organizations that provide immigrant settlement services and other services to refugees and people without status in Ontario. There are many senior managers among the audience, and many of them receive government funding. Well, I guess they all receive government funding and very much depend on government funding to provide these services, which often come with some kind of strings attached. So it might be difficult for agencies who want to do anti-racism work, within the agencies, if there are kind of conditions attached to the funding. So what would be your thought about how immigrant refugee serving agencies can kind of, really, in a way, subvert the settler colonial narrative and dismantle systemic racism in order to, apply a critical racial lens and carry out the mission that way on a day-to-day basis?
So I don't really know. I'll throw out a couple of suggestions. I think it depends a lot on the organization, a lot on the population that's being served, a lot on the constraints for your funding. So it's hard to sort of speak globally, but there's some ideas, some concepts at least you could be aware of. Although it's interesting. So in the United States, in the government official documents, we say we're a nation of immigrants. The Trump administration actually has changed that. They literally have changed the language. So we're no longer in official government documents do we say we're a nation of immigrants. I mean, just think of how insidious that is. And I think instead they replaced it with something like we are a nation of patriots. We're patriotic. It's like anyway. Don't get me started. But at least in that early iteration, as a nation of immigrants, that's actually a beautiful invitation to talk about what immigration means. If you think about that, there's a woman named Isabel Wilkinson. She wrote a book called Warmth of Other Suns. And it's about the great migration of blacks from the South to the North. But she writes it in such a way, literally, I think maybe one of polls her. She writes it in such a way that everybody can see themselves in the story. So when Irish read that, it's like, oh yeah, this is about my family. But she's literally talking very graphically, very particularly about blacks, but she does it in a beautiful way that's, again, sort of inviting people in. So I think there's a way of teaching all this and engaging all this that could do that, invite people in. How do people move? I mean, you can actually, reality is we're not all in Africa anymore. Why do we leave Africa? We've been moving for millions of years, for hundreds of thousands of years, all over the globe. And it's almost always because of some uncomfortable condition. there's a flood, the weather's changing, the environment's changing, and so it's like, okay, we got to go north, you know. Uh, um, the so people move largely for opportunity. People move for or to be close to family, uh, um, and as immigrants, people move because of war. People move because, and then governments, the receiving government, Canada in this case, they have laws and rules. In the United States, it was like, well, you can't come here if you're Chinese. You have to be white. That's our history. You know, I didn't make that up. For much of our history, it was saying you could only immigrate, you can only be naturalized in the United States if you're white. And there were actually a famous case that went to the Supreme Court where an Indian family had lived here for many years. They had children here, so the children were U.S. citizens. The father decided, or maybe the grandfather decided, he was going to naturalize, and he's from India, and he said, "This, I'm a Caucasoid. I'm the original white person. I'm the original Aryan." And the Supreme Court said, well, technically you might be right, but that's not what we're talking about. You can't become a U.S. citizen, and you commit suicide. That's our history. So I think part of it is, and it happens to people, you know, it happened to the Irish, it happened to the Chinese, and of course, blacks were pulled over here in chains. So I think telling that story in a way that just is a story, and you may know that there's 3 sets of documentaries, and they're quite popular in the United States, called Race to Power Illusion, that captures some of this. It's been seen by millions of people in the United States. Spoiler alert, I'm in the film, but it talks about the U.S. history, right? So I don't know, I would even say, I mean, we've actually gone to schools and said, this should be part of your curriculum. You know, if you appreciate this, there's a lawsuit being contemplated. There's something in every state in the United States saying the states have an obligation to provide an adequate and efficient education, which is something I helped put in place in the 90s. And now some lawyers saying, you can't be adequately educated in the United States if you don't learn about anti-racism. Now, I think it's a chance of us actually moving that forward if this election goes the right way. And they've asked me to be involved, which at the time I will be involved. But also I want to do it in a way that even though there's pain and this is terrible, to do it in such a way that, again, sort of not just calling people out, but calling people in. This is our history. And yes, it affects Black people, the way we took land from Native people. But also, maybe when you came over from Scotland, you were mistreated. If you were Catholic, when you first came over, you were mistreated. And so it's something that we've done to people, as people, to each other for a long time, and but we're better than that. We're trying to do better than that. So I think there's a way, and the reason I'm somewhat hopeful is that, yes, I know Canada is not perfect. My son went to school at McGill. He had many stories to tell. But I think in many ways, Canada is more open than the United States. So I think if with a little luck and the right people, you could advance this history and take some of those strings removed.
Thank you. I think you answered some of the questions that came out. And I think one of them is, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm understanding how you're explaining it, because one of the questions was like, why is it up to the oppressed people to be the one who offer the bridge and to build the bridge? And I think what I hear you saying is that, first of all, I think because we want change, but also because, you know, sort of like it's, in a way, it's like we recognize that we also have power to make that change ourselves. But maybe if you want to elaborate a bit further on that.
Yeah, so you know, there literally is a group now called Bridgers, you know, and these projects, and it's not just oppressed people. I mean, it's literally a billionaire is sponsoring some of the stuff in the United States. I think you're right. We do have power. I mean, you know, People's Institute, Ron Chisholm and those folks down in Louisiana, they're friends of mine, been friends for 30 or 40 years, but they help push the notion that Black people could never be racist because we don't have power. And I said, well, that can't be right. You know, whether we can be racist or not, we certainly have power. We may not have as much power. There's a lack of symmetry, but we have power. And so when you go back to that circle and talk about agency, we have to own our power. You know, there were 4,000 demonstrations about after the death of George Floyd in the United States. Many of those demonstrations were led by Black people. So we do have power. The question is, how do we use it? Do we have enough power? No. And the corporations and the elites have much more power? Yes. Yes. But we have power. So that's one. It's like, and we're trying to imagine a world. We're midwives. We're trying to give birth to a new world. And you could say, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to stay here in this world. Okay. But we've said this world is not so good. We said it's problematic. We said we need transformation. And you could ask the same question. So why should we be involved? The onus be on us. The onus is on everybody. So again, going back to that circle, when I talk about responsibility, we're all responsible. And yes, the responsibility is not even. And I say, you know, when the police has his knee on George Floyd's neck, George Floyd's only responsibility at that point is to try to survive. So I'm not saying that every person will engage in bridge building at the same time, but some of us have a little more leeway. We have more opportunity. I teach at a university that has fairly broad reach across the United States and the world. Every so often people read what I write. When you have power, how do you use it? Now think about it again, bridging. So who are you bridging with? Tell you a very quick story. Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, Neil and Desmond Mee down in Florida. In 2018, they wanted a constitutional amendment to change the Florida law saying that ex-offenders could never vote unless they got some special dispensation from the governor, and the governor was very stingy. So you had 1.4 million people who essentially could never vote. A disproportionate number of them are Black. A disproportionate number of them are Latino. The plurality, the largest group are white. Florida has been, in the United States context, a red state, which means a conservative Republican state, or at least a purple state. It hasn't been blue. So in order to change the Constitution through a voter referendum in Florida, you need 60% of the vote. Blacks are nowhere near that number. I think they're closer to maybe under 20%. Latinos is a larger percentage than Blacks. But even Blacks and Latinos combined don't get you to 60%. So how do you win that? How do you get 60% of the voters, many of whom are conservative, to vote to change the constitutions so that potentially Blacks and Latinos can vote? You build a bridge. A bridge is a way, and I'm not just being instrumental, but from an instrumental perspective, it's a way of building power. And not only did they win 60% of the vote, they won almost 65% of the votes. That was higher than any elected official, governor or senator in the state of Florida. It created a powerful movement, and it changed people. And yes, it was led by ex-offenders. Both Desmond and Neil, the president and vice chair president of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, were both ex-offenders. Desmond is Black, lives in urban area. Neil is white, lives in rural area. Desmond was a Bernie supporter. Neil was a Trump supporter. They bridged. And by bridging, they created some possibilities that weren't there before. So, I think it's powerful. I can tell you two last things. It's not necessarily for everyone, but if you don't want to bridge with a Trump supporter, a bridge between blacks and Latinos, a bridge between Latinos, indigenous people, a bridge between, we have to figure out how to if we just break, we keep getting what we got. We have to build more power, but again, I'm not suggesting this just instrumentally. I'm not just suggesting as a way of winning. For me, this is how we become more human. Being able to recognize each other, being able to listen to each other, being able to say, from a spiritual perspective, we're profoundly interconnected to each other and the earth itself. How do we live that? And the breaking that's going on, to me, is a reflection of right-wing nationalists. And we are in some ways accepting their methodology. I think that's toxic. But for someone who's in pain, who doesn't want to break, doesn't want to bridge, I'd say at least don't break, maybe just bond. But you have to answer that question, I think, ultimately for yourself.
So we unfortunately only have 5 minutes left, and I have like 20 more questions that I want to ask. So I'm going to decide which one that I'm going to ask next. Maybe one that is, okay, I'll ask a couple of questions and combine them together. So, because it seems like the telling story is part of that, as a tool for bridging, for understanding, for listening. So how do we, not everyone, myself included, we're not good storyteller, right? So how do you actually use that, sort of as a way of bridging? And, let's say we, for some of us, we may work on issues, I don't know, let's say police reform, and there's a spectrum of different groups who want different things. How do these groups, how do we, the so-called moderate versus the so-called radical, how do we come together, right? Is it through storytelling, or is it through some other ways that we can work together?
That's a great question. Harari, in a book, Sapien, he talks about how people live in narratives. And David Loy actually wrote a book about stories. So from a psychological perspective, the psychologists say we don't have a sense of self and stable self until we have a story. All of us have a story. We have a story about ourselves. So it's like, hey, if you tell me about how you grew up, it's actually a story. It's not that it's false, but it's selective. You're not going to tell me everything. Debbie, when she starts off by saying, I want to honor my Black ancestors, that was powerful and beautiful. But she could have started off by saying, I went shopping this morning. You're selecting. What are you sharing? And so we all tell stories, but yeah, some of the stories than others. Again, we say change happened at the speed of trust. So a lot of it's relational, but also institutional. So there's a fight here in the United States between police abolitionists and police reformists. And this is in the Black community. This is not between blacks and white. This is in the Black community. And there's some of them reached out to me saying, and they have issues with each other. And some take a very hard position. Unless you agree with me, you're the other. So now we're talking about bridging between the Black community and the Black community. Now we're talking about bridging between progressives. And there's a book by Klein, it's called Why We Polarize. He talks about there's a fight. This is not an exaggeration, it's not made up. There's a fight brewing between vegetarians and vegans. Right? So it's like, okay, that should be a really small bridge. That should just be a step. But we can, part of it is just seeing each other. It's like, okay, I don't eat mean, I'm a vegetarian, but I occasionally eat cheese. It's like, can you forgive me for occasionally eating cheese? Uh, but part of it is bridging happens not just around issues. The heart of it is recognizing someone's humanity, recognizing someone's suffering. That's the secret sauce. Uh, and I have this lovely family. My dad uh, just died, and my mom died um, a few years earlier. My dad was a Christian minister. By many accounts, he was socially very conservative. We could talk about anything. My son was having a really hard time at one point, and I couldn't reach him. My son is, militantly progressive. Um, and this is years ago. But I sent him to spend a few days with my dad. He didn't want to go. I told him he had to go if he was going to stay at the house. He went to visit my dad, and he thought it was dumb. It's like, my dad's a Christian, my son's not. My dad is socially conservative, my son is not. It's like, this man knows nothing about me. Why do I have to go spend time with him? And I said, you have to go, because I said so, right? He had to go for a week. I think he stayed 6 weeks. He came back a changed person. And I said, so what did you and Grandpa talk about? He said, I don't know. But they talked for hours. What they did is that they saw each other. They loved each other. And to this day, on my son's phone, his screensaver is a picture of him and my dad holding hands. That's bridging. So bridging is not simply about agreeing. It's like you recognize that even though you do things different than me, Avvy, I recognize your humanity. I love you as a human being, not because we agree on all the issues. So that's the practice, but it's not easy. So start between the vegetarians and the vegans. We'll start there, and then we'll move out.
Thank you. So I know the time is 12:30. I have no idea whether we can extend this session or not. I'm going to ask Debbie to chime in.
Unfortunately, we will have to end our session now. If you have a final word, or if Professor Powell has a final word.
No, I don't have any final. I just want to thank you again for giving me the opportunity to share the stage with John. There is one question I'm also curious myself. John, someone is asking, why do you not capitalize your name? Maybe you can explain that in your final comment.
Sure. So it's interesting. In the 60s, when Black people were reconnecting with their ancestors because we were cut off from our ancestors in enslavement, I was looking at taking an African name because I was carrying the slave name, and my mom wasn't having it because I was named after her father, and I was also reading E. Cummings, and then the whole thing with Muhammad Ali was happening, and then also I was shifting the way I related to the universe. I feel like capital is like domination, as opposed to in relationship, and I thought, trying to change my name to relate to my ancestors while pissing off my mom, there was something strange about that. So I went to her and I said, what if I drop the caps? And she said, I don't care about that. just don't, you got my father's name, you keep it. So I did, I dropped the caps. And it was a way of saying, now here's the one interesting thing. Late in life, my mom has passed, my dad has passed. My grandfather, my mother's father, was Native American, 100%. His name, John Anthony Powell. John Anthony Brimson, actually. And I realized that's not a Native American name. So, I'm still carrying, even I was given his name, which is his colonial name, right? It's like, and so I've been trying to find out, unsuccessfully so far, what was his Native American name? I don't know. And I'm hoping that before I leave this place, I can find that out. But that's why I don't use capital letters.
Thank you, Professor Powell. Thank you, Avvy Go. What a wonderful conversation, and what a great way to end. John, thank you so much for your compassionate, gentle, thoughtful, and thought-provoking presentation and answers to the questions. You make us all want to go away and begin um, to mimic your behavior and the way that you approach the world and this important work that we do. Hard work, as you said. Um, Building bridges isn't always easy. But I love the fact that you talk about instead of calling out people, let's call them in. Something for all of us to learn from. Avvy, you were your regular fabulous questioning, moderating self. Thank you so much. Um, Looking forward to it. I've been receiving emails from people in the audience who are saying, "Please tell us that you've recorded this." Yes, we recorded this, and yes, we will be sharing. We will be sharing it. John, we look so much forward to your ongoing work and to your writings that you share with us so well. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you,
Thank
Debbie.
you. Thank you to our funders. Thank you to our techies. I didn't get a chance to chat to thank our techies. Thank you to our techies. Thank you to Stephanie Brown, OCASI's fabulous event planner, who is making this all happen, and it feels so easy when we know it isn't. It's all the background stuff that's happening. Stephanie sent us a picture on Sunday night, just showing what the back tech looks like, and it's so intimidating. If we had known, we would never have said yes to this. So thank you all. Please remember to join us in our marketplace, go browsing and shopping, chat to people back there. I want to thank our funders once again, IRCC, MCCSS, United Way of Greater Toronto. For those of you who have some time over lunch, visit our wellness site. Do some exercise, do some yoga, exhale. Chat with your people, network, and I will see you this afternoon if we happen to be in the same workshop. We have 6 concurrent workshops this afternoon, all fabulous. Enjoy day 2 of the 2020 OCASI Executive Directors Forum. See you in the morning for the next plenary. Thank you, Avvy. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you.
Bye-bye.
wonderful afternoon.
You too. Bye-bye.